As we all know, this is Father's Day weekend. Tomorrow coming up is Father's Day. And as everyone probably figured out, all of you that aren't mothers here today are fathers in some way or another. And I'm going to reference that by the definition that's in dictionary.com. So it says that father is a male parent, a father-in-law, stepfather, or adopted father, any male ancestor, especially the founder of a family or line or family line. It says a man who exercises paternal care over other persons, paternal, protector, or provider, and a person who has originated or established something. So that last definition is kind of iffy if you think about it, because a person who has originated or established something could be a woman, which wouldn't put her in that father category, but that's the definition of the dictionary, so I'm not going to go any further than that. And when we think of what the role of a father is supposed to be in today's society, how do we define that role, father? God has given men a great privilege of imitating him as father, but only if man chooses to take on that responsibility. We look at how the world is today. We look at how society has imposed in some ways what a father should be, what a mother should be, how a family should be raised, and all of those different things. But when it comes down to it, how as a father, and all of you that are fathers out there, how does that stack up, and how you and what you had to go through to be a father in this world? Once a father, always a father, right? It's not something that you can step away from. It's either good or bad or indifferent. So the title of my message today is going to be Like Father, Like Sons. So first of all, let's evaluate what standards God has set forth for fathers. God's standards suggest that anyone who is a father should first be a good husband. So therefore being a responsible father first dictates us being a good husband. And fathers must love, honor, nourish, and cherish his wife in every aspect of her life also. And with that, I'll go through some of the verses in the Bible, but everything within the Bible that we read can be associated with being a father, being a mother, being a child. It's just about how we live our lives as Christians. So let's turn to 1 Corinthians first, and I'll start in chapter 7, and I'm going to read verse 1 through 5. And as I mentioned, this is what it requires, or the responsibility of a father is based on God's standards. Verse 1, chapter 7. Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So that's one verse, one reading, a few verses in chapter 7 of Corinthians, and now I'm going to go to Ephesians chapter 5. I'm going to start in verse 25. Ephesians 5, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. Right? So, I read those two verses, and I want to put some emphasis on this because we all know that Satan is responsible for the challenges that we face today as a family. You know, his purpose is to take away the family element so that we might perish based on his plan to overcome God, right? We should keep this in mind so that we can be discerning as God's children. You know, we know that history repeats itself, and we all know what happened with Adam and Eve as it regards Satan, right? Every distraction and every challenge that we face today should be given to God through our Savior, Jesus Christ, so that we can be without blemish on his behalf. So the first step for being a good father is being a good husband based on God's standards. And I say that and I put emphasis on that. You know, we hear, and you know, since it's Father's Day weekend, this is why I'm talking about the fathers, but this applies to wives and, like I said, children and everyone that's part of God's family. You know, we go through life, and as a father, as a husband, as a friend, as anyone that we've been at one time or another, we know that there's challenges, and we get caught up in the daily lives that exist and that has been dealt for us, and mostly based on the peer pressure of society. So we go through these things, we do what we do, and that's why some of the things that I'm mentioning here are so important for us to remember. You know, we beat ourselves up, we lift ourselves up, we do things that we feel that we need to do for ourselves to keep going, but we need to hand everything over to God to kind of help guide us in the right way. And I mentioned the first step of being a good father is being a good husband, and some of the verses that is associated with that. So now I'm going to go back and go through another step of being a good father. And this was mentioned by Paul, because we know how difficult it can be in raising children. And it doesn't stop. You know, when our children become adults, we still have a lot of influence on their lives, and they have a lot of influence on ours. So trying to keep them safe and nurture them is one of the biggest challenges that I can recall as a father. You know, every now and then, you know, I remember, and every now and then still, the girls will come over and they'll get into a conversation that leads into a discussion about their childhood. One of those is, and you know, we think about it lightly and funny, because one of the things that used to happen, and I'm sure it happened in everyone's family, is they would ask for something. Now, me being the father, knowing that I don't want this to happen, because it's easier to not have to worry about it than to be concerned about it, I kind of deflected, and I would say something like, well, go ask your mother and see what she has to say. So that was like the handoff, right? Now, Felicia would be in a situation of where she had to make a decision. Sometimes the output would be, well, let me think about it, or maybe later. once in a while, or throughout the time of their upbringing and growth, they kind of figured out that those were two words or two sentences that meant no. Instead of saying no, she would say maybe, or let me think about it. They grew to understand what that was going to mean, and it could be that could go both ways, because sometimes a maybe would mean maybe, but a lot of times it meant no. I just don't want to put a lot of effort into it right now, because I don't want you to do it either. So I kind of passed the buck on that a little bit, and then Felicia was kind of stuck with trying to say no without saying no, you know. So now back to what Paul said in Ephesians 6. I'm going to go to Ephesians 6 and verse 4. It says here, "And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord." You know, once again, we know that parenting is not easy. And it takes a lot of patience to raise children in a loving manner. Sometimes as parents, we lose sight of that when it comes to discipline. You know, we tend to react whether out of fear for their safety or something like that, or we may overreact to something. And we should just keep in mind that parents should act in love and treat our children as Jesus treats the people he loves. And what does that mean? And, you know, as a young parent, it takes a lot to understand this. And, you know, we all know that being a parent, a young parent, we're not ever equipped with how well we bring our children up, because sometimes, you know, we're a little green and don't know what to do. But as we grow and as our children grow, we kind of learn and adapt. So you kind of feel bad for that oldest child sometimes, because it's an experiment of upbringing, if you will. Then the younger child kind of learn from the older child, and the parents become more experienced. So the younger child get a little bit more, I'd say, understanding of who their parents are and what to do and what not to do. So bringing up a child is a challenge, especially for your first child if you're young and inexperienced and don't know everything, and you're trying to do it on your own, you know, as a family, you know, much less having just a mother or just a father trying to bring up children, right? But here's my thoughts. You know, as a father, you know, there are spiritually led attributes that we should maintain for our children. And some of those attributes are responsibility, accountability, and possibility. I'm going to read something that, you know, if we had been aware of it as the young father and mother early on, you know, in our children's life, this would probably be a very good place as a starting place to start nurturing your children. And that would be in Matthew 5, and I'll start in verse 1. I would think being able to instill this into your children early on than have them and make it where they understand it would be a lot better than, you know, waiting later in life. But sometimes we don't see these things or understand these things until later as we mature, even as adults and parents. But I'm going to read the Beatitudes. If we had taught our children these early on and taught them in a way that they understood it, I believe life and upbringing would have been a lot easier. So chapter 5, let's start in verse 1. And seeing the multitudes, he went on the mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the pure in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You know, those things and teachings of life and upbringing for children are probably some of the most profound teachings that they could get as a child. And along with your loving discernment for who they are, so that they know that they are loved as if they're part of God's family and part of their own family. So as Paul mentioned also in Ephesians, a father shouldn't provoke their children to wrath. Fathers shouldn't purposely do things that make their children scornful or angry, resentful, discouraged, and bitter. And if a father would follow these beatitudes, then they would know not to do these things. So everything that we read and we understand based on biblical teaching will go right back and become the foundation of how we raise our family. So let's go to now Colossians chapter 3. I'm going to read Colossians chapter 3, verse 21. Fathers, once again, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. You know, and there's a difference between doing something that is right for them than whether they like it or not, such as disciplining them or setting rules and boundaries for their own good, than it is for doing something that angers them for no good reason, just because you feel that you're the father and you're in charge. You know, unfortunately, there's a lot of that out there, family provoking, fathers, mothers, anyone, older brothers and sisters chastising their younger siblings. These things are in the family. Nothing wittily about it, but it teaches bullying. It teaches all of those things. We see how there's so many confused children that grow up to be confused as adults as a result of parents and provoking them to wrath. So, we see that. Satan has done a good job in skewing what a family is and how we should raise a family in our society as Christians. In many homes, children have been provoked to wrath in other ways. Some could be because of the father's absence. In some cases, a mother has chosen a lifestyle that prevents a father from seeing the children, sometimes for selfish reasons. Mothers, will have to deal with that decisions. However, though, more often than not, it is due to the neglect, irresponsibility, and selfishness of a father that the home does not feel his presence. Some of those things, more than a mother keeping her children from her father, is based on the father's actions. And that's society now. That's what this world has become. That's where we are at to date. It's unfortunate. Another thing, though, is even when we consider normal homes where both parents are in the home and we consider it fairly stable, children are provoked to anger because the father could be too busy to be a father. So those are some other things, Hopefully some of these examples can show us how Satan has disrupted a family in more ways than we even realize sometimes. Sometimes a father get caught up with ambitions, want to climb the corporate ladder and he think he's doing a favor to his family. He's not home. He's working late. Other times he's pursuing personal hobbies that take him away from his family, building his own boat or whatever, things like that. And, these are some of the things that we see as fathers. Then there's the abusive father, both physically and emotionally. And there's situations where the father demands things of the family that he won't do himself. All of these things can and will provoke a child to anger and wrath. And we have to be aware as fathers and parents in general. Most of you guys that I'm talking to today, along with myself, most of our children are grown and out of the home, but that doesn't change that desire or that responsibility and accountability as a parent, because we always want the best for our children. It's important for a father to nurture his children, to understand the responsibility and roles within the family as it is pleasing to God. That's when you start to establish the foundation. A father presence along with the presence of Christ through examples and teachings should be felt in the home, in its rules, in the way we worship, and through the father's love, through leadership and example. One of our biggest problems today is too many fathers is not spiritual and takes on the role of a stern person with no emotions if they are there. Like I was saying, the world's evolving into something that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago was not, something that a family would have as part of what is defined as, fathers, that don't know their children that doesn't know their fathers. I mean, if you think about it, this is an issue with today's society. The change in society has a large impact on bringing up children. One of the issues fathers face today in society is that they don't know God. How can you nurture your child in a godly way if you don't know God yourself? Children need to be taught from a young age about the Lord and the Father, and it must be taught to live by those commands. Once again, train and admonition to your children means more than simply discipline and punishing them for wrongdoing. A father should spend time, instruct and train the children to do the right thing. We must be able to bring them up or feed and nurture them on these things because, they have to be instructed on how to do that which is good so that they can avoid those things that's evil. They must be instructed regarding the straight and narrow path that's mentioned in many places in the Bible that leads to God's kingdom. And then they must be reminded to stay on that path. And the hope of the Father is that they will carry this training with them into their adult lives. So the ultimate goal is to nurture them so they will be able to also submit their lives to their Heavenly Father, as this is the way they should go. And they can continue to teach their children and their children's children. Satan has really taken the whole family element off track. Like I said, you never once you're a father, you're always a father in a sense that if you love your children as Christ loved his children, which are you, which are them, which are us, then you will continually strive to make life better for the future generations. You know, we go back and we talk about responsibility, and now, you know, let's talk about some accountability as well. You know, what is a father's accountability? You know, we hear it a lot. Children are a blessing from the Lord. Let's go to Psalm 127. I'm going to read Psalm 127, verses 3 through 5. And it says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with them, with their enemies in the gate." So these are blessings, and with all blessings, there comes accountability. You know, as a father and as fathers, we must realize that God gave this responsibility of nurturing our children to us, just like Christ nurtures us. We nurture our children, and that's a good example of why we should put God first in our lives. It gives us a foundation to teach our children. It gives us a foundation for that, and then it gives them a foundation to teach theirs. He didn't give that responsibility just to mothers. You know, even though mother's role is absolutely necessary in these things being carried out, he did give it to fathers and mothers, and fathers to kind of set that tone. You know, he didn't give it to the daycares to take care of our children or nurture our children, because they might not have the same system of belief. He didn't give it to the babysitter. That's temporary. You know, he didn't give it to the nanny. He didn't give it to the grandparent. And he didn't give it to the church or the school or the youth program. He gave it to the fathers and the mothers, the parents of the children. So we see how things have been skewed off course, right? Some of the people in daycare, we don't interview those people. We send our children to daycare. They could be people that work there that are Satan worshipers. They could be, on the outside, nice people, but we don't know what their foundation is. So we can't rely on daycares or any other organization to put God's understanding into our children. You know, I remember when we were, you know, bringing up our children, a lot of times, you know, and you get used to it. It becomes part of your life and part of who you are. You know, didn't like to get babysitters we didn't like to get babysitters for the kids a lot of times. So we stayed at home a lot when that was the situation, or we would take the kids with us, you know, and then, you know, there was the discipline because, you know, a kid's gonna try and do what they want to do. So that's just the way it works, right? So keeping them with us, you know, dreading to have them go somewhere without us being there. I remember not wanting them to even come out to Colorado before we lived out here. We moved out here. They would want to come out for the summer as they got older, and you know, that was something that I kind of mulled over a lot, because you don't see how they are doing. You can't just touch them and understand that they're doing okay. So that was something that we went through as parents, you know. So once again, you know, God gave us the responsibility and accountability for our children. So we are rewarded as fathers for these things. So we have to remember that it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God when we don't live up to our accountabilities. And that is in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 31. And I talked about responsibility and accountability. So what are the possibilities here? You know, I could once again go to many verses in the Bible, throughout the Bible, that speaks of responsibilities and accountability and even possibility. Among other things, we need to grow closer to God as a family. And, you know, the Bible speaks of these things or have been inspired to show us these things and these possibilities of bringing up godly children, despite of the craziness and wickedness of our current world today. You know, it speaks of creating a strong bond between a father and his children all the days of their lives. It speaks of a day when, you know, the elderly are left to die in a lonely and despair place. It speaks of all these things. It also speaks of the possibility of happiness, well-adjusted children who love God and their families. It speaks of the possibility of spiritual children. And most of all, it speaks of the possibility of God's kingdom for fathers and for their children, as well as their mothers, of course. And this is ultimately what life is all about. This is ultimately how we are being nurtured as parents, as Christians, as children of God, to continue to teach our children and keep them safe and give them insight and a foundation for God's love. You know, we talk about that a lot, and we go through some of the things that the Bible mentioned, you know, reading John, an example. Another place that you would want to definitely teach your children at a young age, you know, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And all of those things that make life tolerable and makes a child adjust to Christian living. We need to be able to understand ourselves once again. We need to have that understanding of godliness, that understanding of who God is. And we should pray for that understanding as it pertains to us raising our children. You know, once again, we are a people that's trying to bring joy to the lives of others based on God's love. You know, what better place to start than the foundation of a family? You know, more lights are better than a few. You know, if you bring up your children to be a light, then the light just shines brighter throughout the world. And we have to get back to that foundation. And it doesn't stop as your child being a child. You know, your child is still your child as an adult. You know, there's always reconciliation and giving them that understanding that, you know, maybe they didn't think you were there for them as they were growing up, but it doesn't stop you from being there for them as adults. You know, children see things in an interesting light, if you will, when they're growing up. You know, as a father, you know, once you discipline your children and you speak to them in a tone of let's say, anger, they remember that. They tend to shy away from that tone, or when you use that tone, they feel somewhat intimidated throughout their childhood. So, these are things that they hold on to, that because it's a fear, and people tend to hold on to fear, if you will. But there's a way to alleviate some of that fear by offering the love and the understanding and the nurturing that comes along with the discipline that cause them to see that side of you. Just like God, he mentions that he's a loving God, and it mentions it all over the Bible, but it also says that, you should obey and do those things that is pleasing in his sight. Throughout the Bible, I could go to many verses, but I won't. So, for those of you that are fathers, which all men in there are fathers, I would say, in most cases, there's a lot of men that are adult men that are fathers that I know that don't know God, but those of us that do, let's continue to try and nurture our children at no matter what age to be there for them and still continue to convey and make that foundation known so that they can continue to raise their children and their grandchildren so that their children can do those things as well. And that way we will be a bigger family, a more God-loving family, and a family that can grow and all be part of God's kingdom. Happy Father's Day, and thank you.